the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain, our central building here, Linden Gardens. We've been here since 1947. The organisation's been around since 1946. Who came here after the Second World War, and my parents brought me up to, love Ukraine, a country I never even saw until after 1991, really, although I did do 2 trips in the 1980s in England and the Soviet Union. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and it's an absolute thrill and an honour to have Leigh here this evening, and that he considered decided to make contact with Fletcher, who he's known far longer than myself, to launch the book here this evening. Sat next to Leigh is obviously Tom Fletcher, which you all know, and I'm not going to go into the backgrounds of any of these 2 great people because you know their background. And Tom's going to be grilling Leigh, I'm sure, on the book. And obviously at the end there will be an opportunity for question and answers. Afterwards, ladies and gentlemen, we invite you just downstairs into the library where you can take a glass of wine and take a look at our vast collection of Ukrainian books in English and Ukrainian, probably the largest collection of books and artwork, of Ukrainian books and artwork in Europe, basically. A lot of it's still in boxes because it's not long since we've redeveloped and they're still unpacking things as well. Just a few house rules. The restrooms are at the back, one directly at the back, one just to the left. Should we need to vacate the building through the main entrance as you came in, should that be blocked, then down the stairs and through the library and out onto the street. But that shouldn't happen anyway. So without any further ado, there's one thing I am going to say, I'm really envious of this man here. I opened his book and on the inside cover there's a picture of my favourite rock band, Deep Purple. So we've got one thing in common there. But I'm going to pass over to these gentlemen now. Leigh Turner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Petro, and thank you to the AUGB and to you and Fletcher in particular for making this possible tonight. I really appreciate it. We've known each other since the time of I was ambassador in Ukraine, and it was always a great feeling of warmth and friendship when I came here. I'm also very grateful to Tom Fletcher, who is not only the author of The Naked Diplomat, one of the best books about diplomacy that exists, not only the master of Hertford College, Oxford, and a former ambassador to Lebanon, but has 2 hours ago been announced as the new Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief at the United Nations, a massive new job. So I'm really relieved that he's here tonight, actually. So, Tom, thank you very much, and over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Leigh, and thank you to the association. I wouldn't have missed this for the world, not even for Antonio Guterres and the various crises which we might touch on as we go through the evening. I'm really excited to be associated with tonight and with this book. I mean, this is the most fun book on diplomacy that's out this year. I really recommend it because it brims with everything that makes Leigh the diplomat's diplomat. Not just the expertise and the experience, but that desire to kind of get out there and have the adventure and to have that cultural antennae and curiosity about the world, but to do it with authenticity. It's very easy, and many of us who've worked in diplomacy know many, many diplomats who you can spend 20 years with and you have no real idea what their personality is really like. But we all know from knowing Leigh and from this book, you know, that sense of mischief that comes through it, and adventure as well. And all these very handsome photos, I notice. I don't know who selected your photos, Leigh, but I think all of us need your photo editor, basically. They've done a terrific job. So the plan is, I'm gonna grill Leigh a little bit on the book, and maybe we'll try and get him to read a couple of passages as well, which would be terrific. But I'd also like to open it up, because I'm sure you'll have questions too, and I would really like this to feel like a more of an informal conversation, so we really get the best out of Leigh. But I thought maybe before we plunge into some of the big crises that I know we'll touch on, can we just get more of a sense, because this is a book about life behind the curtain to a large extent, and most people out there don't know what life is like as an ambassador. The assumption is always that we eat lots of Ferrero Rocher chocolates, and drink lots of champagne. I don't know about you, but I haven't eaten many Rocher chocolates, and I don't drink enough champagne, really. But what about food and drink? Do food and drink have they played a big part in your diplomatic life?
Yes, well, absolutely right. There is a chapter in the book actually called "How to Drink Wine and Know Things," because alcohol has for a long time greased the wheels of diplomacy, and we've all been to these ghastly national days where you stand up there for hours queuing to shake the ambassador's hand, and then you eventually go in and there's a sorry display of food and drink, and you think, why am I here? And yet everybody wants to be there. Everybody wants to be at the national day. And I describe a little bit in the book how to get invited to a national day if you want to be. And there is this image of immense glamour. And I try to counteract that a little bit in the book. There's a scene I describe in the secure speech room in the Moscow embassy back in about 1994. And we had something to celebrate. I can't remember what it was. And a whole group of us came together in this secure speech room and closed the door. We were sitting around this table, the most secure place in Moscow. And to celebrate, we had some cartons of long-life orange juice and some plastic cups. And the ambassador started droning on, about whatever we were celebrating. And we were pouring out this orange juice and sipping at it. And as we did this, we noticed a not very popular person who was on the other side of the table. And as she poured the orange juice, this kind of green, viscous mass like kind of snot was coming out of the bottom of the orange juice. It was obviously several years past its sell-by date. And this woman started lifting the cup to her lips, and we were all looking at her aghast, and we were trying to get the message to her round the table that she shouldn't be drinking that orange juice without interrupting the ambassador, obviously, which was unthinkable. So, there is this image of glamour, but it's not always true. And in a way, I don't know what you think about this, Tom, but my experience, I've served in some embassies which were considered tough environments, like Moscow or Kiev, to some extent Istanbul, although Istanbul's a lovely city, but it was a very violent city at the time I was there, a lot of terrorist attacks. Or I've been in Vienna or Berlin, and the esprit de corps, the mood, the morale in the embassy seems always to be better in the tough places. I don't know, what do you think?
I'm sure that's right. And often when you talk to people at the end of their diplomatic career, the postings they've most enjoyed haven't been Ambassador Washington or Ambassador Paris. It's been when they've run a smaller, medium-sized post, there's a bit more adventure going on, a bit less glamour, and a bit more action. So where did you most feel that in your diplomatic career? Where did you feel you were really on your game and mojo was there?
There is a chapter in the book called "When Diplomats Dissemble," when diplomats lie, and it's actually the answer to this question, which is that you can never give a straight answer to what was your favourite posting, because the people in Istanbul don't want to hear that you really loved Kiev, and the people in Kiev don't want to hear that Austria was really fantastic. So, I mean, all of my jobs were amazing. There were a few places where I went and I just thought, well, bloody hell, this is extraordinary. And that would include going through the Tunnel of Doom, the Anjob Tunnel in Tajikistan. If you go from the south of Tajikistan to the north of Tajikistan, you go through these amazing mountains, and there's this tunnel built by Yugoslav engineers in the 1960s, which hasn't been repaired since then. No ventilation. The ground is a sea of protruding steel reinforcing bars. You can hardly breathe, full of water, ice stalactites forming everywhere. And you feel as if you're on the front line. You're going to do something interesting. And in fact, we were going to visit an abandoned uranium mine and try and find out what the economic potential was of this place. And I think it's those exotic moments that you remember most. Of course, it's great to have a guard of honor when you're ambassador in Vienna and, you feel frightfully important. But on the other hand, when you are pressing the flesh in some remote part of Central Asia, or when you've gone off to meet the governor of Novosibirsk and is giving you a hard time about why your delegation is so small and you're so junior, those are really good experiences, strange as it might seem. It's the tough posts. I mean, I mentioned, somebody mentioned Roger Glover. Yes, Petro, yes. Roger Glover is the bassist with Deep Purple, and he's been with Deep Purple since the 1960s. And I got to know him in Kiev. He happened to be in the Hyatt Hotel, and I went and introduced myself. And then he came to Vienna as well. And when I asked him to give a testimonial for the book, he replied within seconds. He said, yeah, sure, of course I'd do that, mate. You know, totally normal. Because I quote him in the book. And I mentioned how important you can feel as a diplomat, as well as how stupid you can feel as a diplomat. And it's important to keep your feet on the ground. And I asked Roger Glover this. I said to him after the gig in Vienna, I said, look, you've been a global superstar for 4 decades, or even 5 decades. You know, how do you keep your feet on the ground? And he sipped his neat vodka and said, yeah, well, it helps if you don't take yourself too seriously. And I thought that was fantastic advice for all of us.
So how did you keep your feet on the ground then? You might come in from a grand diplomatic reception or having just done some great peace deal. Where was your hinterland? Where was your escape from the outward-facing nature of the job?
Yeah. I think hinterland is a great word. I'm not somebody who advocates taking your whole self to work. You know, I think you should leave a lot of yourself behind at home. And I was always kind of playing a role at work. I mean, I don't know how it is or was for you, but you know, I don't want to be that stuck-up ambassador, but at the same time, you're often a leader of a group of people, and so you have to actually play the leader, and you have to try and inspire other people. So that's really important. And for me, it was extremely important to have my downtime. You know, when I was ambassador in Kiev, it was my first role as ambassador, and the house was a great big mansion built for a Ukrainian minigarch, you know, a small oligarch. And it had this huge room in the middle with a bridge over it. Going the second floor, there was a bridge linking up the 2 halves of the second floor. And then you couldn't get from one end of the house to the other without going through this big room. And when I'd been at my own reception for a couple of hours, I'd feel exhausted. You know, I'm a bit more at the introvert than extrovert end, and I just wanted to get away. So when I'd done my speech and said hello to everybody and done my duty, I would leave. I'd leave my second in command to sort things out, and I'd go to my room. But there was no way of getting to my room without going back through this giant room in the middle of the house. So I had to go down into the basement to the bomb shelter and go along this corridor, sort of almost crawling on my hands and knees, and then come up the stairs on the other side. And then I'd literally go to bed and just lie there, and I could hear the reception going on downstairs, and I would relax. And you know, that's one way of doing it. And the other thing, of course, is writing books. You know, I've been writing thrillers for the last 30 years with conspicuous lack of success, but they're great fun. I really enjoy writing them. I've got great agents now who are busy selling them, sitting at the back there. Thank you for coming. You know, writing fiction is a fantastic release. I know, Tom, you've written several thrillers too.
So I want to come on to some of that sort of harder end of the job and of diplomacy and running embassies and stuff. But just before I do that, the worst food you've ever eaten? Have you ever had to eat any horrific meals in the service of your country?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's horses for courses, isn't it? I mean, some food, like kokoreç in Istanbul, you know, fried intestines in a lamb's liver. But then other people would say that's a bit like haggis. So, you know, haggis is great. It's never bothered me, Tom, actually. I've eaten some very exotic foods, particularly in Central Asia, actually. I've had a lot of great Chinese banquets when I was dealing with Hong Kong. But probably, without exception, the worst food I've eaten has been the food I've cooked for myself in the evening.
Fair enough. Should we have a bit of the book?
Yeah.
Should we have a bit of the book? Yes. Yeah, big nods.
Great. Okay. Well, look, I've picked out a little bit from the prologue, which the prologue is just talking about diplomacy in flux, and this section is called Hitchhiking and Diplomacy. In 1983, I told my boss in the Department of the Environment that the Foreign Office had accepted my application. Diplomats are all hopeless, he said. You'd be mad to do it. That's what they told me in New York in 1979, I said, when I set off to hitchhike around the United States. They said I'd be raped, castrated, and sold for medical research before I reached New Jersey. But I made it home. The same hitchhiking skills that helped me get home safely in the summer of '79 proved invaluable in diplomatic life. Take, for example, my ride with Ray, a shambling, swarthy, sunken-eyed bear of a man who picked me up outside Durango, Colorado. The first thing I saw when I peered into the cab was his butcher's arms, broad and sheened with sweat. Next, I took in his tattoos and his square jaw, thick with stubble, set in a sullen half-smile. A broken six-pack of Schlitz was wedged between his thighs. Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. What's made Milwaukee famous made a loser out of me. Was it dangerous to enter the old Ford pickup? Standing by the roadside in the cooling evening, I had seconds to decide. Where are you heading? I asked. Cortez, he replied, the next town. I nodded and climbed in. Here you go. The driver nudged me with a beer. The name's Ray. The seatbelt's broken. Thanks, I said. The cab smelled of camphor. I wound down my window and took a sip. Long trip? No. He tossed an empty bottle on the floor. I heard a clinking sound. Just out of prison. On parole. What were you in for? It seemed polite to ask. Killed a man with a pool cue. Judge said it wasn't premeditated. Sure wasn't, just kind of happened. I gazed ahead and took another sip of my beer. The rest of this story is on my blog if you're interested. Both hitchhiking and diplomacy require tolerance of uncertainty. Both rely on building relationships, earning goodwill, and influencing people. In both, you have to take the measure of others, make quick decisions, and act on them. In hitchhiking, you stand by a roadside, not knowing if anyone will ever stop or where any ride may take you. In diplomacy, you may live and work anywhere in the world in 5 years' time. You'll have new colleagues, a new culture, and maybe speak a new language. In my final diplomatic job, as British ambassador to Austria and permanent representative to the UN and other international organizations in Vienna, people suggested I should share my experience and give something back. Few jobs offer such a stimulating career. Some of the diplomatic lessons in this book may, to use civil service parlance, be STBO, stating the bleeding obvious. Others may, I hope, offer some insights into diplomacy and life in general. Welcome to the world of real diplomacy.
Excellent. Did you hitchhike here tonight?
Yeah, I still do hitchhike occasionally, but for reasons that probably not for tonight, hitchhiking isn't what it was.
Do you think, it's hard to imagine a young diplomat today setting out and being able to take those risks. Do you think it's become a bit more vanilla, a bit more risk averse as a profession? Has health and safety gone mad? Well,
it's interesting that whenever I talk about diplomacy, the thing people are most interested in is work-life balance, particularly if it's young audiences. You know, they're worried about the 24-hour requirement, you know, the fact you've got to be ready to go all over the world. I think there is certainly a kind of grade inflation in the civil service and in the Foreign Office. Responsibility is constantly being lifted up. I remember when I was resident clerk back in the 80s, so resident clerk was an official who would just sleep in the Foreign Office in a kind of rather ghastly bedroom. And you weren't on night shift, you were asleep. And if something happened, they'd wake you up and say, deal with this. And I remember on one occasion, I was a first secretary, you know, so quite junior, and a thing came in from a Royal Navy captain in the Pacific saying, we've picked up these Vietnamese boat people and we want to land them in country X, but the Prime Minister of country X wants to be assured that the British government that I have the British government's backing to land these boat people in this country. Can you do something? So I said, sure. So I went and I sent a diptel, or I sent a formal instruction saying, you have the Foreign Office's backing to land these Vietnamese boat people. It didn't occur to me to consult anyone, you know, to phone somebody up. I mean, no undersecretary in those days would welcome being woken up to talk about Vietnamese boat people. And I was fully authorized to do that. And this is much less common these days. I think back in the day, as communications improve, it's easier and easier for government level people, for ministers, even prime ministers, to authorize things. We see it even in terrorist operations, where there are these ghastly pictures of a United States president sitting in an operations room authorizing for a terrorist to be killed. It seems, I know it's political, but it just seems bizarre that people should be taking decisions at that level about relatively less important things.
It's definitely an area where the comms has actually meant that we are less autonomous, less independent. There's a great letter from Gladstone, actually, where he complains that he hasn't heard from the ambassador to Spain for 2 years. He says, if we do not hear from him for another 2 years, we should send him a message. And it's lovely. I just love the idea that... and I found a letter, actually...
Those were the days.
Those were the days. I found a letter from my predecessor in Beirut where he'd written back to Palmerston and said, I think we should arm the Druze against the Turks. And by the time he got the reply saying, on no account, arm the Druze against the Turks, bit too late, they've just won the civil war.
Yeah. That's the same with Hong Kong. The British sent back a message to London saying, should we take over Hong Kong? And it took years to get back there. And by the time the message came back saying, on no account should you take Hong Kong, we'd taken Hong Kong. So, yeah.
So I want to dig into some of the tougher stuff, because it isn't all hitchhiking and stale orange juice and so on. Can you take us behind the scenes, as you do in the book, of the Ankara bomb and what it's like to deal with a kind of real-time crisis?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, if you're a diplomat, you are more likely to face some kind of major crisis in your job than you are in most other professions. Of course, if you're a police officer or involved in the fire brigade, there are lots of people who deal with crisis on a day-to-day basis. But as a civil servant, this will happen to you if you're overseas. And luckily, I did one job earlier in my career, which was as I was head of ops, head of operations in what was called Security Coordination Department, which was a department, it was really counter-terrorism department, but we were trying to hide our existence from terrorists. Just all it did was confuse people. But what that meant was that we were constantly dealing with real-time operations. And I remember once being woken up by a phone call from the ambassador in the embassy in Quito in Ecuador, and he said, some guerrillas have occupied the embassy, what should we do? And again, actually, funnily enough, I phoned my boss, who was Hilary Sinnott, who was the head of the department, and he said, you deal with it, I'm going back to sleep. Again, you had more responsibility. And what that meant was that you got used to dealing with crises. And the most important thing in dealing with crises is the muscle memory. It's having done crises before, having been trained in dealing with crises, and knowing, above all, what you're going to do in the first 15 or 30 minutes after the bomb goes off or whatever it is. And the case you mentioned, Tom, it was in Turkey, and the ambassador was out of the country. And I was just coming back from a lovely birthday weekend, actually, in the suburbs of Istanbul, coming over the Bosphorus Bridge, literally, with the water gleaming on the light gleaming on the water below us. And I got this phone call from the First Secretary in Ankara saying, a huge bomb has just exploded in the center of Ankara, dozens, if not hundreds of people killed. What do we do? And people say that diplomats love a good crisis, and a sense of calm descended on me, because I thought, everything else is now unimportant. All that matters is dealing with this crisis. I know what to do. I've dealt with crises before. I've chaired crisis committees before. So I said to him, look, call the crisis. I'm going to be back at the consulate in half an hour. We'll have a meeting in 1 hour. I want you to set somebody phoning all the hospitals to find out if there's any Brits involved. I want you to call in these people, and I named the people who should be there in the crisis committee, and we'll have that meeting and we'll take it from there. Please phone the Foreign Office, tell them this has happened, say that we're calling a crisis, and so on. And it gives you an enormous sense of responsibility, of course, an enormous sense of purpose to be in that situation. I mean, I know you've been ambassador in Beirut, and you must have seen this constantly. But at the same time, it's also pretty scary if you haven't been trained. And that's really the difference. I think when you've done it before, when you've had the training, you just feel calm in a crisis. Whereas if you haven't had that training and if you're not sure what to do, it's very alarming.
Do you think, I mean, there's a chapter in the book, a great chapter on how to be an ambassador, which I wish I'd read before I was an ambassador. Do you think there are lessons from that experience of being an ambassador that are transferable, that would apply to leaders in other fields?
I think being an ambassador is just a leadership job like any other leadership job in many respects. And I do think there are definitely lessons for leaders in other areas. One of the most important lessons, I think, is always put your own seatbelt on first, or put your own oxygen mask on first. We see it in the aircraft, you know, we need to, if you've got a child next to you, the temptation is to put the child's oxygen mask on, but what you've got to do is look after yourself first, because only then can you help your child. And in a way, what I remember most are the times when I failed at this. I remember going out to Kiev, and I was ambassador in 2008. It was an embassy under some pressure. You know, Ukraine is always, in a sense, in a state of some crisis. There's always some kind of thing going on with Russia. We were all working long hours, and I was determined. I'd been on the leadership course, you know, and it said you mustn't work too hard, you know. So I carefully didn't learn how to lock up the embassy, so I wouldn't be the last person to leave. But it was so stressful trying to get out that I actually did learn how to lock up the embassy. Then I could work for a few hours late into the night and relax, and I felt less stressed. But what it meant was that I was repeatedly leaving the embassy at kind of 10 o'clock at night, and it was very dark. It was the middle of winter, and one night I went out, and I locked up the embassy, very complicated procedure, put the alarm on and all that, and I set off, and I had to go through these 2 vehicle gates to get outside, and the ground was covered in snow and ice, and I was listening to Green Day, I remember, on my headphones. So I was kind of listening to this, and I was thinking I must unlock these gates. And I unlocked the first gate, went through, and I was in this total darkness in between the 2 gates. And I thought, God, you know, this is really slippery. There's a bit of fresh tarmac. Look, somebody's laid some fresh tarmac along the edge. That'll be easier to walk on, you know, a bit less icy. So I made to step on it, only to realize that it was a 2-meter deep trench, that somebody had been repairing the wall of the embassy, and I'd been about to step into it, and I would have perhaps broken my leg, lain there in sub-zero temperatures all night. And what's the lesson? The lesson is you've got to look after yourself. I mean, it wasn't long after that, a few months after that, I had all kinds of health problems, rushed into hospital, and I remember they thought I might have had a stroke. In fact, I hadn't had a stroke, but they were... My Colombian doctor said to me, she said, "I'm going to hospitalize you," which of course in English means I'm going to cause you grievous bodily harm. But anyway, she said, I'm going to hospitalize you. So she sent me to hospital, and on the way there, I thought, am I having a stroke? Am I going to die? And there was a woman with me in the thing where I was going to have an MRI, and she said, the MRI is so frightening that I had to have a general anesthetic when I went into the MRI. So she was supposed to be there to reassure me, but it wasn't going too well. Anyway, we got to the place, and I remember getting into this MRI. Probably many of you have had them, you know, it's like a tube, and famously there's a lot of banging goes on. And I remember sliding into this tube and thinking, this is great. Nobody can reach me here. Yeah. The phone can't go off, I can't do anything, I can just... And let's hope this lasts as long as possible. And I really enjoyed my MRI. So the long story short, you know, as a leader, you've got to look after yourself. It's really important. And I know it's leadership 101, but it's easy to forget that. And it comes back to Roger Glover, actually. Again, you know, don't take yourself too seriously. Don't think it's only you that can do things. And the day that you learn to delegate really important stuff to your team is the day that your life becomes worth living.
That's absolutely right. I often say to my students, you know, we've been doing this for centuries. Just breathe, drink water, and get enough sleep. Yeah. And yet they're the first 3 things we all stop doing on a really busy day, or when suddenly things get a bit out of control. You need to have that extra cup of coffee, or you don't drink enough water. What about terrorism? So I'm asking for a friend here who might be spending the next 4 years dealing with terrorists and trying to mediate around the world. Your conclusion is actually quite dispiriting on terrorism. There's a sense that actually it's almost hopeless to try. Whereas I think often when you talk to diplomats and others, they'll give you the much more positive story about ultimately you negotiate and you find ways to find common ground and so on. Why the depressed conclusion on terrorists?
I am depressed about terrorism for many reasons. When I first started working on terrorism back in 1989, I had a lot to do with the intelligence services, and in particular with the security service, MI5, which I hadn't had much to do with before. And I remember a very senior woman in MI5 giving me this book called The Savage War of Peace. I don't know if you've read it, by a British author. And it's about the Algerian War of Independence. And that took the form initially of terrorist attacks against the French authorities in Algeria. And that war went on until eventually call them terrorists, call them freedom fighters, call them the indigenous people of Algeria, they won that war. And in the book, they set out very clearly the goals of the terrorists in that war. And the goals of the terrorists were to commit such grievous atrocities that they would provoke the civil power into striking back with such force that the terrorists would gain new recruits. And it worked brilliantly. They would say a dead civilian girl is worth 10 dead soldiers, because that will force the authorities to strike back. And, you know, I'm no expert on the Middle East, but, you know, on the 7th of October, I thought there's no chance, 7th of October last year, I thought there is no chance that Israel will be able not to strike back. You know, I didn't realize quite how hard they would strike back. And, you know, whether that is breeding more terrorists or whether that is solving the problem, you all will have your own opinions. And I'm afraid I just think that the inequality between the weapons of the terrorists and the weapons of governments is only going to get greater as the world becomes more globalized, as every terrorist act can be put on the internet immediately, and it's a kind of unequal struggle between governments and any pressure group, including terrorists, who wish to impose their will on other people. I'd like to, you know, I may be completely wrong. I hope I'm completely wrong, and that we will see in 20, 30 or 50 years that terrorism is no longer a problem, but I'd be frankly very surprised.
What I'd love to do is open up to questions in just a moment, but before we do that, could we get a bit more of the book? And maybe, because I'm conscious of where we are, can we do a bit of Russia?
Yeah, sure. Well, really, Ukraine. Russia, Ukraine. There's a chapter in the book called How to Understand Putin's War on Ukraine. And I think it'll go down quite well in the AUGB, in the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain. This is a little section called Why Putin Doesn't Understand Ukraine. I say here, in 2014 and again in 2022, President Putin seemed to believe his own propaganda, that Ukrainians were basically Russians who'd been led astray. He seemed to think Ukrainians would welcome Russian troops. How did he get it so wrong? We can find the answer in a long essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which Putin published on the 12th of July 2021. Long essays by political leaders are rarely a good idea. They smack of hubris. If your president is such a brilliant historian, why isn't he, it's rarely a she, teaching history somewhere? Such screeds tend to be authored by authoritarian rulers who have convinced themselves that their brilliance is the only thing standing between the country they lead and the apocalypse. Putin's treatise is no exception. He argues that Russians and Ukrainians share not only a common heritage, brackets, debatable, but also a common destiny, making him a soothsayer. He talks about ethnic Russians, as if Russians are unique as opposed to, like every other nationality on earth, a mishmash of DNA fragments stretching back through time. He says that Ukraine includes Russian lands, as if these could possibly be defined. and as if all countries, most notably Russia itself, don't incorporate territory that used to belong to someone else. This is dangerous stuff, because as we saw in 2022, it seeks to legitimize the destruction of some or all of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. It's based on mystic mumbo-jumbo, the confused, out-of-date rant of a 71-year-old who's never even lived in Ukraine. People across the former Soviet Union, as in any other post-imperialist setup, have a mixture of identities. When I arrived in Russia in 1992, the country had existed for less than a year. The idea that other newly independent states were real countries was difficult for us too. But 30 years have passed. That's longer than the period between the First and Second World Wars, or the lifetime of the Berlin Wall. In that time, much has changed. Russia faces a demographic crisis with a shrinking, aging population. A 2020 study in the Lancet forecast that Russia's population would fall from around 146 million in 2017 to 106 million in 2100, even including surging immigration from Central Asia. The ethnic makeup of the rest of the FSU has changed too. In Kazakhstan, Russians outnumbered Kazakhs as recently as 1979. Now Kazakhs outnumber Russians 4-1. Nearly all countries of the FSU are loosening their ties to Russia, and not just in Europe. China and Turkey have boosted links with countries in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. When I visited Nazarbayev University in the Kazakh capital Astana in 2012, the language of instruction was English. Since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Kazakh President Tokayev, formerly an ally of Putin, has refused to recognize the fake Russian referendums that Russia has held in occupied zones of Ukraine, and has said Kazakhstan upholds the inviolability of international borders. None of this is the result of a plot by anyone. Rather, it is people from the former Russian Empire choosing their own paths. After independence in 1991, Ukrainian nationalism surged. This is not the place to debate the history of the Slavs from the 9th century, although Ukrainians do like to point out that Kiev was a sophisticated city for centuries before Moscow existed. But anyone who's lived in modern Ukraine can see that Ukrainians are as different from Russians as, say, the Irish from the English. Speaking Russian no more makes Ukrainians Russian than speaking German makes Swiss citizens German. In 2009, I attended the opening of the Donbass Arena in Donetsk, a magnificent football stadium by the same team that designed stadia for Bayern Munich and Manchester City. In addition to a set by Beyoncé, the highlight was a speech by President Yushchenko, who always spoke Ukrainian in public. When Yushchenko began speaking, the Russophone crowd, few of whom had voted for him, booed and whistled. But as he began to praise Donetsk and the Shakhtar football team and Rinat Akhmetov, the owner of the club, the crowd began to cheer and clap, applauding the Ukrainian-speaking president's wisdom and judgment. Unfortunately, President Putin witnessed none of this. If he had, or if he had spent more time experiencing other aspects of post-1991 Ukraine, he might have been less likely to launch his catastrophic wars of 2014 and 2022.
Yes, indeed. Quite right. Right. Where would you all like to take it now? We could go further into Russia, Ukraine. We could go behind the curtain further of life in diplomacy. Questions? What would you like to put to Leigh? I've got, yes, sir, in the middle. And then.
So my question is actually to the both of you. As a diplomat, what would you recommend for young people who are wanting to join the Foreign Office? What sort of experiences would you recommend that they get in order to get to the position where you two are right now?
Sure. So the UK system is very unusual in the way it recruits diplomats. If you were French or German, You would be expected to do specific courses before you even applied to become a diplomat. You would be expected to know certain languages. You would be expected, if you were German, probably you would have a law degree, etc., etc. In the UK system, all you need to have is any old university degree. Doesn't matter what it is. The exams you will take will be extremely general. So it's a tiny bit of general knowledge, but more of it is about how you interact with other people, how you are at solving problems, what kind of imagination you have. So it's very, very hard to prepare for. And when I speak to students, I always encourage them to get a bit of life experience. You know, the Foreign Office does take some people straight from university, but it takes quite a lot of others who have already worked in different parts of the world. You know, it's great if you speak Mandarin and Russian, but the Foreign Office will give you a test to see how good you are at learning languages, and then they will teach you the languages that you need in whatever job you're going to go and do. Similarly, you know, if you know a great deal about some part of the world, that's really helpful, but it may not actually get you into the Foreign Office. So I would urge you to really study the exams. The exams are highly important. Get some experience of life. Have views on things. You know, if it's not enough to read The Economist. You know, you've got to actually have thought about international relations, the kind of things we're talking about here. You know, probably reading this book would be very helpful. You know, all the things that are in there. And, you know, get to a position where if somebody says to you, you know, what do you think about the importance of Mercosur, or what do you think about the shift in the balance of power in East Asia, that you can say something sensible about it that's not just what you read in the newspaper. So that would be my general view. I mean,
yeah, I think that's spot on. I think people often ask me, how do you get into the Foreign Office? And it's very difficult to put your finger on it, really. But I think the key is actually not just head. It's not just knowledge. It's head, hand, and heart. It's knowledge, skills, and values. And we've recently developed a qualification called Global Competence, which I think is really the key to it, which is this ability that if you were dropped into Kyiv or Astana or hitchhiking through Germany, that you'd have the curiosity about the world around you and the ability to ask the right questions and to adapt. It's emotional intelligence, really. I say to my students, it's like, visualizing that we all have an Instagram filter on the world through which we see things, and the ability to take your filter off and to recognize that everyone else has their own filter. That actually is the key, I think, to diplomacy. That's what gives you that emotional intelligence that you need. It's something you can see that, you know, Leigh has. If you drop Leigh anywhere, you won't even know you're doing it, but you'll be analyzing the room, you'll be thinking about, I mean, again, not in a scientific way, the interaction between the different people in the room. You'll be thinking, well, I wonder why so-and-so's grumpy today, and so-and-so looks like they've had a bad day or a good day. All of that's going on somewhere in that head, and it's very difficult to teach it. And the best way to learn it is to get out there and practice and travel and talk to people.
There is a story in the book, actually, about my visit to Anguilla. When I'd been to see the prison, I'd been to see the government, I'd been to see all the projects that were going on in Anguilla, and it was time for me to catch my plane, but I had a couple of hours, and the governor sent me in his Range Rover with his driver, Granville, to have a look around the island. And he showed me around the island, and we saw this and that and the other. He said, this is where Jennifer Aniston split up with Brad Pitt, you know, other important sites. And at the end, he said, do you have time to go for a swim? And I said, sure, you know, I've got my trunks here in my suitcase. So he drove down this very rutted, narrow track, and we arrived at the beach. And it was a completely godforsaken beach, beautiful beach, but very off the beaten track. There was just a shack there with a bemused, middle-aged American tourist sitting there watching us. And he watched as I got out of the car and took my suit off, went behind the car door, pulled on my trunks, got the snorkel, walked down to the beach, swam around a bit, looked at the fish, thought, yeah, you know, this job has its moments. Came back, all wet. Granville was waiting there with a towel for me, so I dried myself off, went behind the car door, pulled off my trunks, pulled on my suit again, made to get into the car, and Granville was holding the door open for me, and the American said to me, how do you get a job like that? And, you know, I mean, the same question you've just asked, in fact. And I said you have to take some exams, yeah.
I think there was one. Yes, please. And then, yeah.
Just a couple of questions to the two of you again. You talk about when we all went to school, we went to university, then we have to make a decision what we want to do. What clicked in your heads to become diplomats is the first question. And secondly is more pointing to ourselves here at the association. How do you envisage the war ending in Ukraine? Which is a difficult one. I'm asking for a personal view, not
Yeah, sure. Well, let's do the war in Ukraine first, because that's a really serious thing. I'm afraid I'm pretty pessimistic about things. I think that we're in a grinding war of attrition. I gave a long interview to Times Radio on Monday in which I said Ukraine can still win this war. Russia likes to portray itself as strong. Putin, as an authoritarian leader, likes to portray himself as strong, almost to the point of parody, riding around on his bareback on his horse with no shirt on. Not a pretty sight, some people would say. So you have this situation where Russia is not as strong as it likes to appear, but Ukraine is in terrible trouble too. And in order for Russia not to win this war, the West has to step up over months and possibly years with a steady supply of high-grade weaponry and large-scale financial support to prevent Russia winning this war. And if that happens, there is every possibility that Russia will be defeated. Because Russia's allies, who are they? Iran, North Korea, that's about it. You know, they've got India and China buying their oil and stuff, but they're not really allies in any military sense. So Ukraine can win this war, but persuading people in Western countries, such as the UK, Germany, the US in particular, that what happens in Donetsk really matters to voters in Delaware is a stupendous political challenge. We've seen the difficulties, even under a democratic president over the last few years, that for 6 key months, the US wasn't sending military supplies, and Ukraine immediately started losing the war. Now we're back with supplies building up. Ukraine's doing kind of okay, but still not winning the war. Russia is still pushing forward. So it's a really, really difficult situation. And I think that Western leaders have to step up and persuade people in the West why this matters. And just in case any of you are in any doubt about this, the reason it matters is that if Russia is allowed to win this war, even if the front line were frozen where it is today and Russia only, quotes unquotes, took 20% of Ukraine, by the way, an area about the size of England, that would simply lead to further aggression by Russia in the future. It would simply encourage Russia to attack other countries. And third, and most seriously for all of us, it would completely overturn the entire international order since 1945, whereby countries are not allowed to attack their neighbors and steal their land. If Russia gets away with this, we've already seen it with Venezuela claiming 80% of Guyana next to it. And this will go on. And the piffling, relatively speaking, investment that the US and other countries should be making to arm Ukraine is a bargain compared with the costs that will be coming to taxpayers in the US, UK, and other countries if Russia wins this war and the world becomes a much, much more dangerous place. So I'm afraid I'm pretty pessimistic. It's not impossible, but Western leaders have got to step up to the mark. What was the other question?
I agree with you on that one. The other question was about that moment when you realised you wanted to join the Foreign Office and go into this world.
Yes. Well, in my case, I mean, I was, my father was a university professor, and it was at the tail end of colonialism, actually. So in the early 1950s, when he was a religious man and he wanted to help poor people, and so he couldn't be a missionary, they had enough missionaries, so he went off to teach in the University of Zaria in the north of Nigeria. And so that was where I was conceived, in the north of Nigeria, and was born in the UK. And then My first 3 years were in Nigeria, and then ages 6 to 12 I was in Lesotho in southern Africa. And it had an impact on the way I think about things. You know, I don't feel myself perhaps as passionately British as some people. I joined the Department of the Environment as my first job out of university. Fantastic colleagues, really interesting work. One of the lessons of this book is don't judge a book by its cover, because actually my 4 years in the Home Civil Service, I did 4 of the most interesting jobs in my life, much more interesting than most Foreign Office jobs actually. But I would look out of the window of my 17th floor office in the Department of Transport and think, you know, if I have a really great career, in 20 years' time, I'll be in that window there. You know, and it wasn't that inspiring. Whereas, as we were saying earlier, in the Foreign Office, you never know where you will be. And the idea that just staying in the UK wasn't enough for me was pretty deeply embedded after a peripatetic childhood. So, you know, the idea of being in the Foreign Office seemed attractive. The idea that you could be paid to go and live somewhere and really get under the skin of that country, fully understand it, learn the language, meet the people. It's such a privilege. And I think for me that opportunity was then realized in the adventures you see in this book.
Really good. I mean, I think mine are very similar actually. It come down to music, travel, and DNA. Yeah. Music, you know, when I was sort of 15, 16, I was listening to U2, and through them I started thinking about Martin Luther King and South Africa, and sort of joined Amnesty International, and just got excited about that sort of battle against injustice in the world, and then started going traveling a lot. I went to Kenya and became a boxer and was a failed boxer. I went to America, became a failed door-to-door salesman. Went to the Middle East and became a failed teacher. And then sort of thought, well, there's only one other job I can do where I can actually carry on traveling. And this we'll delve into this over a glass of wine later on. But for me, the DNA bit is Nigeria as well, northern Nigeria. Yeah. So my grandfather spent 50 years there in education,
there you are,
up around Kaduna.
Right, same place.
And I found his letters to my grandmother. When I was at Oxford, I went to find, I was told his letters are in the basement. And I went down and said, have you got them there? And they just said 1 page. And that was it. So I went off disappointed, went back and said, are you sure, Tony Shillingford? And they said, no, Anthony Shillingford. We've got 22 suitcases of his letters. And, you know, I spent 6 weeks just in my grandfather's head. You know, and that gave me a massive passion for seeing the world and traveling and listening and learning and so on. Ready? What would you like to ask?
Well, I should like to pose a question quite linking to the previous conversation. So, in order to make it succinct and a bit, I already have orchestrated the question already. So, what is the most effective way for Western diplomats? So, technically, that question regarding Russian-Ukrainian crisis. So, what is the most effective ways for Western diplomats to balance the use of sanctions as a tool for the pressuring Russia while keeping diplomatic channels open and intact?
Well, I'm a big fan of sanctions, and I think it's great that the Western community has imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its 2014 invasion, which were then sharpened up in 2022 after the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The trouble is that sanctions are harder to impose on a large country than they are on a small country, and you have to keep working at it. And what we've seen continually since 2014, and even more so since 2022, is that, you know, Russia is working incredibly hard. It's an existential crisis for Vladimir Putin. If he loses this war, he faces a very uncertain future. So he is bending the entire resources of the Russian state to evading sanctions. And we keep seeing these ghastly images or statistics that show that people are getting round the sanctions. There was a report on Sky TV about Range Rovers being smuggled from Georgia through into Russia. And there was there's been lots of stories about Russian oil and all kinds of terrible sanctions evasions will always go on. You have to keep sharpening it. However, this doesn't mean that sanctions aren't effective. And I always say that the Russian political elite, or Putin's grip on power, is like a kind of concrete bridge where you see some hairline fractures in it, and you don't quite know whether that concrete bridge is about to come crashing down or whether it's still sound. And those of you with long memories will remember that in modern times there have been 3 putsches in Moscow or in Russia. The first was in 1991 against President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. The second was in 1993 against President Yeltsin. I was there in Moscow for that, and hundreds of people killed. And then the third was in June 2023 by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, who went on TV, or went on the internet, same thing these days, and said, look, everything you've been told about why Russia had to invade Ukraine is a lie. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There is no threat from NATO or from Ukraine. There is no threat to Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine. And he started a march on Moscow, in the course of which he effortlessly occupied Rostov and then set off north. And again, large numbers of people were killed before he was brought to a stop and kind of bought off with some vague promises. I think probably he found that it wasn't as easy organizing a putsch as he expected. So, you know, there are pressures within Russian society on Russian elites brought about by sanctions, and we should continue to impose them, and we should continue to sharpen them when we can.
So we have one question at the back, 2 more. So what I'm going to do, a very, very quick fire round, and then we'll do the last 2 to close up, because I'm conscious of time. So this is so quick fire that you have to try and give one-word answers if you can, and certainly no more than 1 line. And you managed to not answer the question earlier about which embassy you'd preferred working in. So we're going to try to pin you down on some of these. So, in 1 word or 1 line, Keir Starmer's new buyout policy, right or wrong?
Excellent.
Best foreign secretary you ever worked with?
Who was it? David Miliband.
Worst foreign secretary you ever worked with?
Dominic Raab.
Remain or leave?
Definitely remain.
Hardest language you ever learned?
Turkish.
Trump or Kamala?
Kamala, I hope.
And if you could, if Keir Starmer called you tomorrow and said, I've loved the book, absolutely brilliant, we need to get you back in, you can have any embassy in the world, any job in the world, where would you go?
Well, he'd have a hard job persuading me, I must say. Because when I stopped work, I felt it was a bit like bashing my head against the wall, you know. The inability to do and say what you really think is often a challenge. And as the Brexit ambassador in Vienna for most of my time, actually my entire time from 2016 onwards, it was quite a challenge representing the UK during that time. But yeah, if you want a 1-word answer, sorry to have gone over. I mean, British ambassador Berlin, that would be lovely. Applied for, because I'd been ambassador in Kiev, and I just thought, you know, talk about banging your head against the wall, that would be a pretty tough job. I admire people who've done it. You know, I think that's just really a tough job. But yeah, British ambassador Berlin could tempt me.
You heard it here first, folks. So we've got two more questions, gentleman here and gentleman at the back. Well, we might take them together,
sure.
And then see if you can weave them together and manage to steer away. So yes, sir, there.
You've travelled all over the world, you've visited all these embassies, VIPs, diplomats. Well, the pair of you, who was the most scariest and why? And who was the most pleasant?
Great. So we've got that one, and then gentleman at the very back.
Yeah. So, Leigh, what you said about responsibility floating upwards really struck a chord. And I wondered, is there any way of pushing the tide back? I mean, I think about the contrast between my first posting in the late 1980s, when you had a lot of responsibility, communication was difficult, and my last posting in Washington a decade ago, when the long screwdriver was always turning. Is there a way of reversing that so that actually the people in post are empowered to do the things that they know best how to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
So where would you like to start?
Well, let's go with the second question first. I mean, honestly, I think it's really difficult because that example I gave you earlier of the embassy in Quito being taken over, and it was left to me a first secretary level person to sort it out. And I did sort it out. You know, I got on the line to the ambassador. I talked to him. He was a bit preoccupied, you know, guerrillas running around the embassy. And by morning, we'd sorted it out, and nobody was killed. It all went okay. These days, my head of department would have called a crisis meeting and sent everybody into the Foreign Office to have meetings, and probably called a minister, and the Prime Minister would have been consulted, and all kinds of things would have happened. And people say, why do we have no time to do anything now? You know, I think it's really difficult because people can micromanage everything. And I don't see an easy way back except by training. I mean, in the armed forces, which I must say I came to respect when I had a lot to do with them, dealing with counterterrorism and the SAS and so on, they have very clear roles, and there's an enormous amount of delegation at all times, and you're trying to empower people to make decisions. Police constables, another great example. You know, although they would argue they now have to fill in 500 forms for every single arrest they make. But I think for civil servants, it's going to be really tough. I don't see an easy way around it.
I agree. I mean, I've done various reports on the Foreign Office and experienced it from Number 10, where my biggest frustration was that accountability was just spread out to such a degree. I wanted to see the Turner memorandum on something, you know, or the Barrow memorandum on Russian policy, and feel that someone owned the recommendation and took ownership of it and was willing to take a risk on it. Yeah. What normally happened was by the time it got to ministers, it was all so sort of smoothed down and vanilla.
I'd go further. I mean, I think the very structure of emails, whereby you can copy them to 1,000 pieces at the touch of a button, means that there is no ownership of any policy. I mean, I witnessed this during the Ukraine crisis of 2014, when I came back from Istanbul to the crisis centre in London, and copy recipients were out of control. The only way it was possible to do anything was just to not look at emails, ever. So it's very difficult.
In Number 10, I learned to basically throw away any paper that came across that said, this submission has been agreed by the following departments, you know, a list of 12 departments, because to agree it between 12 departments in that way meant that it was completely insipid. There was nothing in it. I would just one area where, and we're not going to plunge into it now, but an area where we were both involved in the great fun early days was around social media. And there were moments there where we were given quite a long leash, partly because the centre didn't know what we were doing. Yep. And I remember getting one message saying, the minister has said, you can only tweet if you're just tweeting in Lebanon, but if you're tweeting in the UK as well, then you must stop. And I said, well, okay, I'll just tweet towards the Lebanese and see what happens. But we were actually allowed to experiment. And now and again, they pulled on our chains a bit. But there was a period where I felt that the centre did relax a little bit and thought, well, actually, they may make mistakes, but let's give it a go.
Yeah. I mean, there were glory days of social media where any official could tweet out or put out messages about anything. And I think it's the same thing, actually. I think we've been overcome by this feeling that everything must be kept under control. And we've repeatedly seen diplomats getting into trouble through this. I had a few run-ins myself with both my host governments and with London. I mean, I remember, I agree entirely what you say about people not knowing what we were doing. I remember once taking the train from Khabarovsk to Vladivostok, which is a 36-hour trip in the far east of Russia. And we arrived in the morning, unshaven, you know, exhausted after sleeping on the train all night, and got off the train at Vladivostok station, and there were 6 TV crews waiting for us to interview me as the head of delegation about what I was doing in Vladivostok, of course in Russian. And you know, I was really not prepared for this, and I muddled my way through it. And yet, a great experience, fantastic for getting to know how to deal with live interviews in Russian on TV. And in fact, it brought fruit, because the governor, Nazdratenko of Vladivostok, who had said he was too busy to see us, when he saw us on TV, he said, okay, yeah, we'll see these guys. So I think there are still corners of where we can do it. But I think the fun's gone out of it a bit.
Yeah. Scariest leader?
Scariest leader? Well, I wouldn't go scariest leader. I think scariest people I've come across are people with guns. I mean, I remember once, it wasn't a diplomatic thing, I was driving with my brother actually through, this was in the days of apartheid in South Africa, and we were going from Lesotho down to the coast of the Transkei, and we had to go through a border of a so-called independent homeland, which was run by these kind of puppet states of the South African government. It was seen as a long-term solution that all the black population would be put in these little homelands, and the whites would keep all the kind of useful areas. Anyway, we went through. We had to go through this control, and it was manned by drunken young men with Kalashnikovs, you know, and the Kalashnikov barrel came through the window, pointing in our direction, and you could smell the drink on the breath of this guy. And I think it's really those moments of putting the fear of God into you, that you're going to be killed. Those are the most scary moments. I mean, leaders, by comparison, as a diplomat, you always feel a certain degree of security. I remember I was once in a great discussion with President Yanukovych of Ukraine, who was a kind of bluff, hearty fellow, and we were talking Russian. And after a while, I said to him, so, you know, I notice you speak Ukrainian in public. You know, which language do you prefer? And he said, oh, well, my Ukrainian's excellent, and proceeded to switch into Ukrainian. And he started telling me all the different kinds of animal that he'd shot at his estate, you know, in order to demonstrate his knowledge of Ukrainian. You know, squirrels, muskrats, rabbits, hares, you know, all these animals I'd never heard of. And then he said to me, look, do you want to come with me next weekend? We'll go shooting. At Mezhgiria, I think it was called. And this was one of my great diplomatic fails. I was kind of scared I might get shot. So I said no, I said I don't shoot, which was, for a diplomat, for an ambassador, that was such a stupid thing to say. I should have gone with him. You know, what was the worst that could happen? I'd get my head blown off, you know. It would have been such an experience to go shooting with Yanukovych. So maybe I was a bit scared of him. And then, yeah, over to you, Tom.
I mean, weirdly, when I ran for the Oxford job, they said to me in the interview, have you ever had to negotiate with any frightening people? And I said, well, apart from Hamas, the IRA and Hezbollah, not really. And the Oxford Dons that I think you'll find this will be much harder. But I'd say, actually, to compliment your, I agree, you know, young men drunk on power with weapons are pretty terrifying. I'd say I'm also pretty scared of narcissistic right-wing extremists with big media followings. And I'm thinking very particularly of one at the moment, who I happily haven't met, actually, and hope never to meet. But the guy who I think was the sort of the pre-Trump Trump was Berlusconi. Mm. And I saw a lot of him. And actually he was quite a terrifying character, really, because there was this very jocular, open, overtly friendly, outward-facing personality, but behind it was pretty dark and sinister and insecure. Sorry if anyone's related to Berlusconi, be bright. But I took him to G8, I took David Cameron to his first G8 summit, and I didn't know about your swimming antics at the time, but I said to David Cameron, you've got to swim in the lake, because the leaders are very theatrical, you know, Putin with, you know, all that. So you've got to show that you're new and strong and, you know, a bit energetic. So David Cameron and I swam in the lake in Lake Kananaskis, and I went into the meeting room, told the leaders, and so Obama was feeling his muscles, and they were all gathered round him saying, oh, David Cameron, you're wonderful. And Berlusconi came in and was very jealous of the fact that David Cameron was getting all the attention, and went out and came back with 7 photos of himself in what I think our generation called budgie smugglers, but very tiny red Speedos, oiled up in various muscle man weightlifting poses, and proceeded to hand these photos to the leaders of the free world. I mean, to see Merkel at that moment really helped you understand the frailties of the European project, very close up. But there's something sinister about someone who can be so insecure and narcissistic and yet is running a country and a media empire. I'll let you close. What's the other one? Friendliest. Who was why don't we close on your friendliest leader or diplomat or...
Yeah. Well, there have been so many. I mean, honestly, I think one of the great privileges of being a diplomat or an ambassador is that you get to meet so many people. And I mean, I've just had such great experiences with so many diplomats, so many politicians, different people. I mean, to give you one example, I remember being invited to a ball in Vienna. And, you know, this sounds like the real diplomatic high life, and it was to some extent. A lot of business is done at balls in Vienna, and they have this thriving ball scene, literally dozens of balls held in the most sumptuous settings you can imagine. And I was invited to one of the socialist balls, you know, if you can imagine that. So it's a ball run which was supported by the SPÖ, the Social Democrats, and the newly elected president was there, Alexander Van der Bellen, who was an ex-Green and quite left-wing originally before he became president. And they learned that I was going to go to this ball. The British ambassador's coming to our ball. We'll put him on the high table. So I went on the high table with Van der Bellen. And Van der Bellen was so nice to me. I mean, I was a bit nervous meeting him, you know, and he treated me like a long-lost brother. And then he invited me to come and have a private meeting with him. He said, on no account tell any of the other ambassadors that I'm going to give you a private meeting, because, you know, then they'll all want to come too. And he did, and indeed I saw him regularly throughout my time in Vienna, and he very charmingly came to my farewell party and sat drinking beer all night until midnight with his lovely wife, and along with various other people. And, you know, it's that kind of warmth. And, you know, again, it's the Roger Glover thing. You know, it's being a human being that's so important. So I'd say that. Can I just say one other thing? Before we stop, there are going to be some drinks downstairs which are free. And amazingly, Bristol University Press, who are a fantastic publisher, and who's the editor of this book is sitting just there, have not only put up some wine and nibbles, but they also have a supply of books which are half price. I don't know why they're half price, but they are. So they're only a tenner each. So do stock up, and I will be signing them downstairs. Or if any of you have bought books already and would like me to sign them, I'll be very happy to sign them downstairs. So after this is finished, don't all buzz off into the night, but come down, have a glass of wine, and we'll tell you the real stories that are too salacious to go in this book. I remember one thing, you don't mind, Ginny. There's quite a lot in here about compromise attempts in Russia. And Ginny said to me, she said, can't you put in a few more of them? They're so fascinating. And I said, I can't, no. I mean, they're just too X-rated. So you have to give me quite a bit of wine before I tell those. But
perfect. So we plan to give you quite a bit of wine now. And we started on alcohol and diplomacy, and we've sort of ended on alcohol and diplomacy. And so that seems a very appropriate moment to head downstairs and get some books signed, ask the X-rated questions. You know, it's almost not quite 9 o'clock, but almost post watershed. But thank you, Leigh. It's a masterclass in diplomacy, a masterclass in life as well, beyond diplomacy. And everyone get that book. It's a fantastic read. And please join me in thanking the fantastic Leigh Turner.